And for our closing keynote, I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker. Dana Goldstein is a journalist and an author of the New York Times bestseller, The Teacher Wars, a history of America's most embattled profession. She also does many different writings and has contributed to Slate, The New Republic, The Marshall Project, The Atlantic, and many other publications. Dana is known to write about education, social science, inequalities, criminal justice, women issues, cities, and health. She's here today to present her research on the history of the teaching profession and how, as policymakers, there's an opportunity for all of us to help teachers improve their practice. Please join me in welcoming Dana to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you, Jeremy, for that really kind introduction. I'm really happy to be with ECS. It's an organization whose research I've relied on so much over the years, just to have a place where I can go as a journalist and see what's happening state to state in our complex 50-state system. It has been so helpful. So I was really grateful to receive this invitation. And thank you to all of you who are sticking with me here right before the beautiful long weekend to talk about the history of the teaching profession. So I wanted to begin by going back in time to 2011 when I began writing my book, The Teacher Wars, about the history of teaching. Now at that moment, I felt as a longtime education journalist that there was something not quite right with our debate over public school teaching in America. Teaching had become definitely the most controversial profession discussed in our public life. In the media, and I am a member of the media, but veteran teachers were generally portrayed as undereducated, as incompetent, and insufficiently committed to closing the achievement gap. Now, research showed then, and still today, that there are really big and serious problems with American public schools, such as a curriculum that's not up to snuff with our international peers, too much rote teaching, too many worksheets, rote learning, and in general, the persistent segregation of our low-income children of color in separate classrooms and separate schools. Now, these are giant moral and political shortcomings. And yet, back in 2011, when I began writing my book, I noticed that the predominant policy response to these issues was very narrow: to weaken teachers' job security protections and then use measures of student learning, which was most often used as a euphemism for children's standardized test scores, to identify and fire bad teachers. Now, if those policies had been a smashing success, helping teachers improve their practice and feel energized and inspired, that would have been a good thing, and I would be here today to celebrate everything that has happened in the past decade. But unfortunately, except for some isolated cases, there really wasn't the sort of system-wide success from those narrow policies. Now, I'm a journalist, and I have traveled the country reporting on schools, so I get to speak with a lot of teachers. And I heard from many experienced and celebrated educators, pillars in their communities, award winners, who said that they were alienated and demoralized by much of the teacher accountability rhetoric that was floating around. And polling backed that up. Between 2008 and 2012, MetLife surveys found that the percentage of teachers who reported being very satisfied with their job plummeted from 62 to 39%, the lowest level in a quarter century. Now, I had assumed that this war over teaching was new, but while researching my book, I discovered that there was actually nothing new about it. Since the early 19th century and the beginning of our common schools movement, American policymakers have often portrayed teachers in two unrealistic, though often well-intentioned ways. Now, the first unrealistic portrayal of teachers is as angels or superhuman. To get a taste of that, I want to move back to the mid-19th century and to Horace Mann, the father of our common schools movement, which was that state-by-state effort before the Civil War to establish universal schooling for all American children, a great social justice movement. Now, in 1853, this is how Horace Mann described the ideal teacher, and I want you to note that he's describing a female teacher here. He said, quote, "As a teacher of schools, how divinely does she come, her feet sweetening the earth on which she treads, and the celestial radiance of her benignity, making vice begin its work of repentance through very envy of the beauty of virtue." Now that is florid prose. To translate that, Arnie Duncan told me in 2009, when I asked him what is an effective teacher, he said, quote, "An effective teacher, they walk on water." Now, the second unrealistic portrayal of teachers that I write about in my history is as embattled and sometimes blamed for large social problems, which, while certainly an element of them traces back to our schools, they are much bigger than schools themselves. In 1800, before the Common Schools movement, 90% of American classroom teachers were men. But when reformers like Horace Mann wanted to scale up our education system, they decided to hire only women teachers. Why? Well, raising taxes back then was about as unpopular as raising taxes is today. So women could be paid back then totally legally half as much as men, and so this was a very cost-effective way to school the American public. Now, in order to raise support for this idea of bringing women into the classroom, and this was a controversial idea because it was still considered very scandalous for a middle-class white woman to get up in front of a group, even a group of children, and talk to you like I am today, Common School movement reformers resorted to vilifying and attacking male teachers as lash-wielding alcoholics addicted to corporal punishment. In one famous 1846 speech, Catherine Beecher, the leading female proponent of the Common Schools movement and Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister, called male teachers, quote, "incompetent, intemperate, coarse, hard, unfeeling, too lazy and stupid to be entrusted with children's education." I'm sorry for the male teachers in the room. Now, this panic about male teachers combined with the sort of unwillingness to have an expensive education system really worked. And by 1900, so we're fast forwarding here, 90% of American teachers in northern cities like Chicago or New York were female. Now, 1900 was a really difficult time for American public education. There were huge numbers of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe flooding into our classrooms, which meant class sizes in some cases of up to 60 kids. And there were not enough desks or chairs, so kids were sitting on the floor in Chicago classrooms. And there was such a huge need for teachers at this time that girls were graduating the 6th or 7th grade and entering the classroom as teachers. So they were hugely underprepared. Now, there's a lot of places we might go with a system like that, perhaps better teacher prep, higher standards, smaller class sizes, but actually it was thought among intellectuals at the time that the real problem now is that women were teachers. So in 1800, the problem was too many men, and in 1900, it was too many women. Charles William Eliot, the president of Harvard, wrote that women teachers were, quote, "physically weaker than men, more apt to be worn out by the fatiguing work of teaching." Now, unfortunately, panics in which policymakers called for large groups of teachers to be fired continued. So we've heard about men and women. During World War I and then the McCarthy era, tens of thousands of pacifist, socialist, and communist teachers were driven from their jobs, even if they never discussed their personal political beliefs with their students. And in an often forgotten historical interlude, after Brown v. Board of Education, 40,000 black teachers and principals in the South were fired, so they would not compete with white educators in newly integrated schools. Now, a lot has changed for the good. At least today, when we talk about ineffective teachers, we are focused on teachers' impacts on their students, not on who that teacher is demographically for the most part. However, the panic about bad teaching that I observed when I began writing my book in 2011 had one major thing in common with the past panics. It was focused much more on getting rid of bad teachers than on figuring out what good teaching looked like and how to replicate it at scale. Now, you all are policymakers, so you know that scale is very important in education policy. In America, we have 3.3 million teachers. 100,000 to 200,000 are hired each fall, and 70,000 alone are hired in our high-needs, low-income schools. So when I was going around the country reporting on teaching, I often asked people who are experts, how many ineffective teachers do you think there are who cannot be brought up to the level we need them to be for our kids? And I heard the estimates ranging between 2 and 15% of teachers currently working are ineffective. So I sat down and did the math. 2 to 15% of American teachers is 66,000 to 495,000 people. Now, I critiqued something Arne Duncan said earlier, so now I want to give him credit for something else he said, which is, quote, we can't fire our way to the top. And that's absolutely correct, because where will all the new, better teachers going to come from, and what systems have we put in place to assure that new teachers coming into the profession are going to do a better job? Another reason we can't fire our way to success is because research shows that teacher longevity in the classroom matters. 3 researchers, Matthew Ronfelt, Susanna Loeb, and James Wyckoff, conducted an 8-year study of 850,000 4th and 5th graders. So this is a very large study. They found that in schools with high teacher turnover, where many teachers were quitting their jobs each year, students lost significant amounts of learning in both reading and math compared to socioeconomically similar peers in schools with low teacher turnover. And here's something really interesting. Students at the high turnover schools lost learning even if their own teacher was not new. I want to repeat that. They lost learning even if their own teacher was not new, and even if overall teacher quality at the school remained constant. So the effect of teacher turnover actually crosses classroom walls. While at first counterintuitive when I thought about it more, I realized that this is actually common sense because schools are communities. When administrators are constantly recruiting, interviewing, hiring, they just have less time to focus on improving instruction. And when many teachers resign each year, institutional memory is lost. There's weaker ties to the community. In short, turnover means that less adult expertise is spread more thinly among children. So if we want great teachers to stay in the classroom over the long term, we have to do something that we've never done before in American educational history. We must do education reform with teachers instead of to teachers. And I think for policymakers, that means that the starting point for improving teaching must be replicating what can be observed by watching the best teachers work. So I want to give you a few examples from around the country of how that is happening. I visited the kindergarten classroom of Lenore Furman in Newark, New Jersey. I saw Lenore singing with her students and getting them super excited about books with complex vocabulary words like hibernate and slither, and watching her teach a group of low-income kindergartners these awesome words looked like magic. Now, it was not magic. It was part of a system. Lenore was a mentor teacher within a program called the Children's Literacy Initiative, which has developed research-backed techniques to help early learners read and write. The Children's Literacy Initiative, or CLI, establishes a model classroom hours in every school in which it works. That classroom has an open door. Novice teachers have time to watch the mentor teacher use their literacy strategies, and the mentor teacher in turn has time to visit the novices' classrooms and provide feedback. Students in Philadelphia, Newark, Camden, and Chicago schools with these model classrooms are outperforming their peers in reading. And I want to point out that this mentorship among teachers takes place outside of formal or punitive evaluation systems. These are relationships of collaboration and trust between colleagues. At Kingsbury High School in Memphis, 1/3 of all teachers are working under the residency model, which I know we've heard about today, in which trainee teachers spend their first year as an apprentice in a master teacher's classroom. This allows them to see everything happens to establish discipline and rapport from the first moment of the school year to the last. This type of full-year student teaching experience is standard in many Asian and European nations, while most American teachers have 12 weeks or less of student teaching experience. Teachers who participate in American residency programs as recruits or mentors have longer career longevity and in many cities have produced impressive learning gains for children. Now, 2 years ago when my book was first published, it looked to me like examples like the Memphis Teacher Residency and Children's Literacy Initiative were isolated experiments and outliers in education policy. But I'm happy to report today, and you've heard it throughout this conference, that this is no longer the case. Washington has invested over $150 million in teacher residencies. States and philanthropies are shifting their priorities too, something it is now easier to do because of ESSA's increased flexibility. I want to tell you about 2 states that are leading the way. Through new legislation, Iowa is fundamentally rethinking the teaching profession by requiring all districts to create roles for model teachers, lead teachers, and mentor teachers. These teachers all receive bonuses ranging between $2,000 and $10,000 per year, and they have time to do this work, and that's really important. Some of the roles call for 75% of the time with children, 25% with adults, and some of the roles are 50-50. So if we can create these roles, but if they're not funded and if they don't have this time in the day, it's not going to work. And Louisiana has launched the Believe and Prepare initiative. In 2014, it is bringing 1,000 new teachers into the classroom with a year-long classroom residency already under their belt. In both of these states, policymakers have realized that the role of the mentor teacher is key. When selecting mentors, we have to look not only for teachers who are great with kids, but teachers who have the demonstrated ability to work with adults and linking theory and practice. These programs are experimental. It's important that as we increase expectations around student teaching, we don't allow our future teachers to get out of the crucial subject matter courses in science or history or any other subject they'll teach that will give them the content knowledge they need to excel. And as I mentioned, we cannot do this on the cheap. Still, I'm cautiously optimistic. If you are a policymaker and wondering what you can do, I know you've heard a lot at this conference, and I'll mention a few other resources. The Council of Chief State School Officers has published a report called Our Responsibility, Our Promise, and explains key state-level policy levers for transforming the teaching profession. They also talk about international examples, what people are doing in other countries. In Singapore, teachers have the opportunity to conduct original research on pedagogy and education policy. This adds to the body of knowledge of what works for students and allows teachers to maintain their own intellectual engagement in their career. Finland decided, and I think this would be very controversial here, but it's worth mentioning, that only flagship public universities could operate teacher training programs, and they simply shut down second and third tier programs. Partially as a result of that change, teacher prep became highly selective in Finland, which many of you know. The profession is open only to people who graduated in the top 10 to 12% of their high school class. Another nation I like to mention is Korea. The career salary range for a teacher there is $55,000 to $155,000 per year. In Korea, a teacher earns more than an engineer and just a little bit less than a doctor. The organization Public Impact also has a website, opportunityculture.org, with ideas on how to redesign the teaching profession to be more collaborative. They suggest paying teachers up to 100% more if they are able to extend their reach by collaborating with adults. With the right federal, state, and philanthropic supports, we can radically reimagine American teaching as a much more creative and collaborative profession, which in turn will help teaching become more prestigious, academically elite, and culturally respected. This would be a change from our historical pattern for teaching in the United States, so we shouldn't underestimate what a big, big shift this would be. We won't get to a highly respected and effective teaching profession with canned or test prep-driven lesson plans. We will get there through creating a career ladder that is challenging and exciting, because teachers are neither superhuman angels nor villains. They are professionals looking to grow. History teaches us that in the end, real educational improvement will be built not upon our fears of bad teachers, but upon the expertise and leadership of our best teachers, who will guide their colleagues to excellence. And this is how we will end the teacher wars. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.